The flames danced against the midnight sky, an inferno of orange and red that consumed everything in its path as Willow Newcomb clutched her father's pocket watch in her trembling hand, watching helplessly as the prairie fire encircled her small homestead. She had barely 20 minutes to live, if that, before the smoke would choke her lungs and the heat would melt the very walls around her. Texas, 1875. The summer had been mercilessly dry in Bandera County, turning the once green prairie into a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. That spark had come 3 hours ago, from where Willow couldn't say, but now the fire had grown into a beast that devoured everything in its path with insatiable hunger. Willow had been alone on her small ranch for nearly a year now, ever since her father had passed. At 22, she had learned to manage the cattle, tend the crops, and defend herself against those who thought a woman alone would be easy pickings. But against this inferno, she had no defense. She tried to flee when she first saw the smoke on the horizon, but her horse had spooked, throwing her hard enough to twist her ankle before bolting away. By the time she'd limped back to the cabin, the fire had already begun to circle around, cutting off the road to town. Now she stood at the window, watching as the flames crept closer. Her auburn hair stuck to her sweat-dampened face as she frantically searched for any escape route. The well was too shallow to hide in, and the creek bed had dried up weeks ago. "Lord Almighty," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the glass. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke had begun to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. Her eyes burned, and each breath felt like swallowing fire. Just as despair threatened to overcome her, Willow spotted movement in the wall of flames to the east. At first, she thought it was merely the fire dancing, playing tricks on her terrified mind. But then the shape emerged clearer, a horse and rider, charging directly toward her cabin through a narrow corridor in the blaze. "Madness," she gasped, watching as the powerful stallion leaped through curtains of fire, its rider low against its neck, a bandana covering his face. The horseman drove his mount straight to her porch, barely reining in before leaping from the saddle. He pounded on her door with a gloved fist. "Anyone alive in there?" A deep voice called out. Willow rushed to unbolt the door, nearly collapsing as it swung open. Before her stood a tall man, his face partially hidden by a soot-blackened bandana, eyes intense beneath the brim of his Stetson. "Thank God," he said, quickly taking in her condition. "We've got to move. Fire's jumped the creek bed and it's coming this way fast." "My ankle," Willow gasped, coughing as smoke billowed into the cabin. "I can't ride." Without hesitation, the stranger swept her into his arms. "You don't need to, just hold on." As he carried her toward his horse, Willow clutched her father's watch and a small leather pouch of valuables she'd had the presence of mind to grab. The man lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one strong arm wrapping securely around her waist. "Keep your head down and your face covered," he instructed, pulling his bandana up higher. Willow buried her face against his chest as he wheeled the horse around. The heat was unbearable, the roar of the fire deafening as they charged back through the narrow path the man had found. She could feel the horse's muscles bunching beneath them, the animal terrified but responding to its rider's commands. Sparks showered down around them, and at one point, Willow felt her skirt begin to smolder before the man quickly smothered it with his gloved hand. They burst through a wall of smoke, the horses' hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth as they galloped away from the inferno. It seemed like they rode forever, the air gradually cooling, the terrible roar of the fire receding behind them. Willow kept her face pressed against the stranger's chest, his heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek despite their desperate flight. Finally, when the horse slowed to a walk, She dared to look up. They had reached higher ground, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the valley. From here, she could see the full devastation of the fire, a massive swath of blackened earth where once the prairie had stretched, and at its heart, a tiny point of light that had been her home. "It's gone," she whispered, grief constricting her throat. "Everything's gone." The man loosened his grip on her waist, but didn't let go entirely. "Buildings can be rebuilt," he said quietly. "Lives can't." Willow turned to look at her rescuer as he pulled down his bandana. His face was streaked with soot, but she could see he was handsome, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and his dark hair curled damply at his temples from sweat. "I'm Vaughn Northcott," he said, his voice rough from smoke. "Was riding back to Bandera when I saw the fire. Couldn't just pass by without checking for folks caught in it." "Willow Newcomb," she replied, suddenly aware of how tightly she was pressed against this stranger. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Let's get you somewhere safe first, Miss Newcomb. Then you can thank me with a cup of coffee if you're so inclined." As they rode toward Bandera, Willow stealing glances at the strong profile of the man who'd ridden through fire to save her. She had no way of knowing that this night, terrible as it was, would be the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. The prairie fire had taken her past, but Vaughn Northcott had given her a future. The town of Bandera was alive with activity when they arrived, despite the late hour. News of the fire had spread quickly, and townsfolk were gathered on the main street, some organizing firefighting parties, others preparing to take in those who'd lost their homes. Vaughn guided his horse directly to the doctor's office, a small whitewashed building with a freshly painted sign. Before Willow could protest that she was fine, just a twisted ankle, he dismounted and lifted her gently from the saddle. "Doc Pearson needs to look at that ankle," he said firmly, "and make sure you didn't breathe in too much smoke. Doctor." Pearson was a graying man with kind eyes and efficient hands. He examined Willow's ankle, wrapped it tightly, and listened to her breathing with his stethoscope. "You're lucky, Miss Newcomb," he said. "The ankle's just a sprain and your lungs sound clear enough. A day of rest and you'll be back on your feet, though I'd avoid too much weight on that ankle for a week or so." Willow nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The events of the night crashed down on her and tears welled in her eyes. "My home," she whispered. "My father's land. Doctor." Pearson patted her hand sympathetically. "The Newcomb place, out by Elm Creek. I'm sorry, my dear, but you're alive, and that's what matters most." Vaughn, who had been standing silently in the corner of the examination room, stepped forward. "She needs a place to stay, Doc. Any suggestions?" "Martha over at the boarding house always has a room," the doctor replied. "Or perhaps the Wilkinsons might take her in. They were friends of her father's, as I recall." Willow shook her head. "I couldn't impose on the Wilkinsons. They have their hands full with their own troubles since Mr. Wilkinson hurt his back." "The boarding house, then," Vaughn said decisively. "I'll take her there." Before Willow could say another word, she was once again in Vaughn's arms, being carried out to his horse. The main street was still busy, and several people called out to them as they passed. "Northcott, you made it back. Is that Willow Newcomb? Lord have mercy, girl, we thought you might have been caught in that blaze." "Vaughn, the ranch hands have organized a firefighting group. They're heading out now." Vaughn acknowledged the calls with nods but didn't stop until they reached the boarding house, a two-story structure with a wide front porch. Martha Lawson, the proprietor, was already at the door, having spotted them coming down the street. Bring her in," the plump, gray-haired woman urged. "I've got a room ready." Poor child, what a terrible night you've had." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the town. Martha bustled about, pouring water from a pitcher into a basin and pulling back the bed covers. "You'll need some clothes, I expect," she said, eyeing Willow's soot-stained dress. "I think my niece left some things that might fit you, and you'll need a bath. I'll have the girls heat water." When Martha had gone, Willow sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling lost. Vaughn stood awkwardly by the door, hat in his hands. "I should let you rest," he said. "It's been a long night." Willow looked up at him, studying his face properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. His eyes were indeed gray, but with flecks of blue, like the sky before a storm. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked softly. Vaughn shook his head. "There's nothing to repay, Miss Newcomb. Any decent man would have done the same." "But they didn't," she said. "You did. You rode through fire for a stranger." A small, almost embarrassed smile touched his lips. "Well, I've been called a lot of things in my time, but decent isn't usually one of them." He placed his hat back on his head. "I'll come by tomorrow to see how you're faring. Try to get some sleep." After he'd gone, Martha returned with hot water and a nightgown borrowed from her niece. She helped Willow wash away the soot and smoke, then insisted she drink a cup of chamomile tea before sleeping. "You're lucky Vaughn Northcott was riding by," Martha said as she tucked the blankets around Willow. "Not many men would brave a fire like that." "Who is he?" Willow asked, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I've never seen him before." Martha sat on the edge of the bed. "He showed up in Bandera about 6 months ago, bought the old Davidson place east of town and has been fixing it up. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings and works hard. Some say he was a lawman up north before coming here. Others think maybe he rode with a rough crowd during the war. He doesn't talk much about his past." Willow nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. "He saved my life," she murmured as sleep began to claim her. "Yes, he did," Martha agreed, patting her hand. "And that tells me more about the man than any rumors could." The next morning, Willow woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the sounds of the town already busy below. For a moment, she was disoriented, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the memories of the previous night came flooding back: the fire, the fear, and the stranger who had carried her to safety. She sat up, wincing as her ankle protested the movement. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and her throat felt raw from the smoke. But she was alive, and for that she was profoundly grateful. A knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance, bearing a tray with breakfast and a small pile of clothing. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by cattle," Willow admitted, managing a small smile. "But I'll be fine. That's the spirit." Martha set the tray on the small table by the bed. "I've brought some of my niece's things for you to wear. She's close to your size and she won't miss them, living in San Antonio now with her banker husband." Willow fingered the simple cotton dresses and undergarments gratefully. "You're very kind, Mrs. Lawson." "I'll find a way to repay you as soon as I can." Martha waved away her words. "Don't you worry about that now. You just focus on getting your strength back." She paused at the door. "Oh, and Mr. Northcott was asking after you this morning. Said he'd stop by again later if you're feeling up to receiving visitors." A curious warmth spread through Willow's chest at the mention of Vaughn. "Yes, I'd like to thank him properly." After Martha left, Willow ate the simple breakfast of eggs, biscuits, and coffee, surprised by her own hunger. Then, with considerable effort, she managed to wash and dress herself in one of the borrowed dresses. a plain blue cotton that was a little loose in the bodice but otherwise fit well enough. She was just attempting to brush out her tangled hair when another knock came at the door. "Come in," she called, expecting Martha again. Instead, Vaughn Northcott stepped into the room, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up since she'd last seen him, his face now free of soot, his dark hair damp as if freshly washed. He wore a clean shirt and vest, though his boots still bore the marks of last night's ordeal. "Miss Newcomb," he said, his deep voice filling the small room. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Northcott," she replied, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Please sit down." He took the room's only chair, placing it at a respectful distance from the bed where she sat. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better than I have any right to, thanks to you." She set down the hairbrush, giving up the battle with her tangled locks for the moment. "Mr. Northcott, I don't know how to properly thank you for what you did last night." Vaughn shifted uncomfortably, as if unused to receiving gratitude. "As I said, there's no need for thanks. I'm just glad I was there." A silence fell between them, not exactly awkward but filled with unspoken questions. Willow found herself studying him in the clear light of day. Without the drama and terror of the fire, she could see that he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen his share of trouble and learned to weather it. There was a wariness in his eyes, too, a guardedness that made her wonder what Martha had meant about his past. "Do you have family in the area, Miss Newcomb?" Vaughn asked, breaking the silence. Willow shook her head. "No, my father died last year. It was just the two of us for many years after my mother passed when I was young." "I'm sorry to hear that." His expression was genuinely sympathetic. "What will you do now?" It was a question Willow had been avoiding since waking. The reality of her situation was stark. Her home was gone, and with it most of her possessions. The cattle she'd kept, a small herd of 20 head, had likely scattered or perished in the fire. "I suppose I'll have to find work," she said slowly. "I have a little money saved and whatever the insurance might pay for the cabin, though that won't be much." "The land itself should still be valuable," Vaughn pointed out. "Once the grass grows back, it'll be good grazing land again." Willow nodded, taking comfort in the practical observation. "Yes, that's true. My father chose the location well, with the creek running through it." She sighed. "But rebuilding would take money I don't have, and I'm not sure I could manage alone anyway." Vaughn leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Miss Newcomb, I have a proposition for you to consider." Willow raised an eyebrow, instantly wary. She'd had propositions from men before, usually of the sort that no respectable woman would entertain. Seeing her expression, Vaughn quickly clarified. "A business proposition, I should say. I've been looking to expand my grazing land, and your property would adjoin mine quite nicely." He paused, watching her reaction. "I wouldn't want to take advantage of your situation, so I'd be prepared to pay a fair market price, or perhaps arrange a partnership of sorts." Willow considered his words. Selling the land felt like a betrayal of her father's memory, but a partnership might allow her to maintain some connection to it. "What sort of partnership do you mean?" "You would retain ownership of the land, but I would rebuild the cabin and use the pasture for my cattle. You'd receive a percentage of the profits and have a place to live if you wanted it." He hesitated, then added, "Or you could take the money and start fresh somewhere else, if that's what you prefer." It was a generous offer, and Willow was momentarily speechless. She wasn't sure why this man, virtually a stranger despite his heroic actions, would make such a proposition. "Why would you do this?" she asked bluntly. Vaughn's lips quirked in a half-smile. "I told you I've been wanting to expand my range, and maybe." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. Maybe I know something about having to start over with nothing, and I'd like to make that road a little easier for you than it was for me." There was a story there, Willow was certain, but she didn't press. Instead, she said, "I'll need to think about it, Mr. Northcott. It's not a decision to make hastily." "Of course," he agreed, standing. "Take all the time you need. I'll be around when you want to discuss it further." As he moved to the door, Willow called after him, "Mr. Northcott." He turned, his gray-blue eyes questioning. "I still owe you that cup of coffee," she said with a small smile. "Once I'm on my feet again." The smile he gave her in return transformed his serious face, softening the hard lines and bringing a warmth to his eyes that made Willow's heart beat a little faster. "I'll hold you to that, Miss Newcomb," he said, and with a tip of his hat, he was gone. Over the next several days, as Willow recovered her strength and grappled with decisions about her future, Vaughn became a regular visitor. Each day, he would stop by the boarding house, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh peaches from the general store, or wildflowers gathered from the roadside. Their conversations gradually deepened, moving beyond polite small talk to more meaningful exchanges. Willow learned that Vaughn had indeed been a lawman, a deputy marshal in Kansas after the war, but had left that life behind after an incident he was reluctant to discuss in detail. He'd come to Texas seeking a quieter life and had been slowly building his small ranch into something substantial. In turn, Willow told him about growing up on the Newcomb homestead, how her father had taught her everything from branding cattle to fixing fence posts, preparing her to run the place on her own one day, though neither of them had expected that day to come so soon or in such circumstances. 5 days after the fire, Dr. Pearson declared Willow's ankle healed enough for limited walking. That same afternoon, Vaughn arrived at the boarding house with a rented buggy. "I thought you might like to see your land," he suggested. "Assess the damage for yourself." Willow hesitated only briefly before agreeing. She needed to face what had happened, to see with her own eyes what remained of her home. The journey to her property took nearly an hour. As they traveled, the landscape around them changed from the bustling town to open countryside, and finally to the blackened prairie where the fire had swept through. Willow gasped when she first saw the extent of the devastation. What had once been miles of golden grass was now a charred wasteland with only the occasional standing tree, its branches bare and scorched against the sky. When they reached her land, the sight was even more heartbreaking. The cabin was gone, reduced to a pile of charred timbers and ash. The barn had suffered the same fate, as had the corral and outbuildings. Only the stone well remained relatively intact, though its wooden superstructure had burned away. Vaughn helped her down from the buggy, supporting her as she limped among the ruins of her life. She moved slowly, picking through the debris, occasionally stooping to touch a blackened item she recognized: the iron stove that had survived the flames, a ceramic cup miraculously unbroken, the metal head of her father's favorite axe. "It's strange," she said finally, standing amid the wreckage. "I expected to feel more sorrow seeing it like this, but instead I feel free," Vaughn suggested quietly. She looked at him in surprise. "Yes, how did you know?" he shrugged, looking out across the scorched land. "Sometimes losing everything can be liberating in its way. All the decisions you've been putting off, all the changes you've been afraid to make, suddenly they're made for you." Willow nodded slowly. "My father loved this place, but I stayed out of duty more than desire after he died. I was afraid to leave, afraid to let go of the last connection to him." She took a deep breath. "But now, I can choose my own path without feeling like I'm betraying his memory." Vaughn was watching her intently, his gray-blue eyes warm with understanding. And what path would you choose if anything were possible? She looked around once more at the remains of her home, then back at Vaughn. Something had been growing between them these past days, something neither had put into words yet. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I think I'd like to find out." They spent another hour at the property, walking its boundaries as Willow pointed out the natural landmarks her father had used to mark their land, a distinctive bend in the creek. A trio of old oak trees that had somehow survived the fire, a rocky outcropping on the eastern edge. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they turned back toward Bandera. Willow was quiet for much of the journey, processing all she had seen and felt. Vaughn respected her silence, guiding the buggy with sure hands, occasionally pointing out a hawk circling overhead or a deer watching warily from a patch of unburnt brush. They were approaching the outskirts of town when Willow finally spoke. "I've been thinking about your offer, Mr. Northcott." He glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. "And? I think the partnership you suggested could work well for both of us," she said, "but I have a counter-proposal." Vaughn raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening." "Instead of rebuilding my cabin, I'd like to use some of the insurance money to invest in your ranch directly. I'm not just a landowner, Mr. Northcott, I'm a capable rancher in my own right. I could be an asset to your operation, not just a silent partner." A slow smile spread across Vaughn's face. "Miss Newcomb, are you offering to go into business with me, truly in business as equals?" "I am," she confirmed, chin lifting slightly. "Though I should warn you, I can be stubborn when I believe I'm right." Vaughn's laugh was warm and genuine. "I would expect nothing less." He sobered slightly, his eyes searching hers. "But you should know something before you tie your future to mine in any way." The serious tone of his voice made Willow's heart skip a beat. "What is it?" Vaughn guided the buggy off the main road, pulling to a stop beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree. He set the brake, then turned to face her fully. "The reason I left my position as a deputy marshal," he began, his voice low. "There was a shooting. A bank robbery in a small town outside Wichita. I killed 2 men that day, brothers who'd been terrorizing towns across Kansas." Willow listened silently, sensing there was more to the story. The third brother wasn't involved in the robbery. He was a businessman in another town, respectable on the surface, but he swore vengeance on me for killing his brothers. Vaughn's jaw tightened at the memory. "He hired men to come after me. They burned down my home, nearly killed me in the process." "Like the fire that nearly killed me," Willow murmured. Vaughn nodded. "When I pulled you from that cabin, it brought it all back." He took a deep breath. "I tracked down the men who tried to kill me, made sure they couldn't try again. Then I decided to leave that life behind, start fresh where no one knew me." "Do you think this man could still be looking for you?" Willow asked, her practical nature assessing the potential danger. "Samuel Blackwater. It's possible. Men like him have long memories and deep pockets." Vaughn's eyes held her steadily. "That's why I wanted you to know before you make any decisions about partnering with me. I can't guarantee that my past won't catch up with me someday." Willow considered his words carefully. The revelation should have frightened her, perhaps made her reconsider her proposal. Instead, she found herself admiring his honesty and the courage it must have taken to tell her. "We all have pasts, Mr. Northcott," she said finally, "and none of us can guarantee what the future holds." She reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his where it rested on the buggy seat. "But I've learned that life is too short and too uncertain to let fear rule our decisions." Vaughn looked down at her hand on his, then slowly turned his palm upward, intertwining their fingers. "Are you sure, Miss Newcomb? This isn't just about business anymore, is it?" The directness of his question sent a flush creeping up Willow's neck. "No," she admitted softly. "I don't believe it is." For a long moment, they sat in silence, hands joined, the only sounds the rustle of leaves overhead and the occasional stamp of the horse's hoof. Then Vaughn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent a shiver racing down her spine. "Then I accept your counter-proposal," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "On all counts." The partnership between Willow Newcomb and Vaughn Northcott became the talk of Bandera over the following weeks. Some approved of the practical arrangement, seeing how it benefited both parties. Others raised eyebrows at the impropriety of a young, unmarried woman entering into business with a bachelor, especially one as mysterious as Vaughn. Martha Lawson, however, became Willow's staunch defender, informing the town gossips that Miss Newcomb was a grown woman fully capable of making her own decisions, and if they had nothing better to discuss than her business arrangements, perhaps they should direct their energies toward helping those still recovering from the Prairie fire. For her part, Willow paid little heed to the gossip. She was too busy dividing her time between helping at Martha's boarding house to earn her keep and riding out to the Northcott ranch to assist with the operations there. Her knowledge of cattle proved valuable, as did her eye for horse flesh when they attended an auction in San Antonio to rebuild the herd that would eventually graze on her land once the grass returned. Vaughn was true to his word about treating her as an equal partner. He sought her opinion on business matters, taught her about the parts of ranching her father hadn't covered, and listened when she suggested improvements to his methods. Their working relationship quickly developed into a deep friendship, built on mutual respect and growing affection. They were careful to maintain propriety, never being alone together in the ranch house or at the boarding house, always conducting their business in public places or with ranch hands nearby. But their feelings for each other grew nonetheless, evident in the lingering glances, the way Vaughn's hand would brush hers when he helped her into the saddle, the smile that lit Willow's face whenever he appeared in town. 6 weeks after the fire, on a warm September evening, Vaughn invited Willow to dinner at the ranch. Mrs. Holloway, the widow who served as his housekeeper, would be present as chaperone, he assured her, but he wanted to discuss the future of their partnership now that the initial arrangements had been made. The Northcott ranch house was modest but well built, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Willow had been there many times before, but always during daylight hours and always on business. Tonight felt different as she arrived in a borrowed dress of soft green calico, her hair arranged more carefully than usual, a touch of her mother's old rosewater behind her ears. Mrs. Holloway greeted her warmly at the door, ushering her into the dining room where Vaughn waited. He stood as she entered, and Willow's breath caught at the sight of him in his Sunday best, his dark hair slicked back, his usually weathered face freshly shaved. "Miss Newcomb," he said, pulling out her chair, "you look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Northcott," she replied, hoping he couldn't hear the quickening of her pulse. "You've gone to quite some trouble for a business dinner." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Perhaps this isn't strictly business after all." The meal was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a peach cobbler that Mrs. Holloway proudly announced she'd made from Vaughn's own recipe, handed down from his mother. "I didn't know you could cook, Mr. Northcott," Willow teased as she savored the sweet dessert. "There are many things you've yet to learn about me, Miss Newcomb," he replied, his eyes holding hers across the table. Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat pointedly, reminding them of her presence. "I'll just clear these dishes and make some coffee," she said, gathering the empty plates with a knowing smile. When she had gone, Vaughn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I wanted to give you something," he said, sliding it across the table to Willow. Curious, she opened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. It was a silver locket, simple but beautifully crafted, with a small flower engraved on its surface. "Open it," Vaughn encouraged softly. Inside was a tiny, precisely cut square of charred wood. "From your cabin," he explained when she looked up in question. "I went back the day after we visited together and found it. I thought you might want something to remember where you came from, even as you move forward." Tears pricked at Willow's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect," she whispered, closing her fingers around it. "Would you help me put it on?" Vaughn rose and moved behind her chair. Willow lifted her hair as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The locket settled just above her heart, a tangible reminder of all she had lost and all she might yet gain. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you tonight," Vaughn said as he returned to his seat. "Something important." Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses broke the evening quiet. Not one or two riders, but several, moving fast toward the house. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, his expression shifting from tender to alert in a heartbeat. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to the window. "Mrs. Holloway appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Riders, Mr. Northcott," she said, her voice tense. "6 or 7 from the sound of it." Willow rose, ignoring Vaughn's instruction to remain seated. Who would be calling at this hour in such numbers? The answer came in the form of a shout from outside. "Northcott, Samuel Blackwater sends his regards." Vaughn's face went pale. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, moving swiftly to a cabinet where he kept his guns. "Mrs. Holloway, take Miss Newcomb to the cellar. Now." But Willow stood her ground. "I'm not hiding in a cellar while you face this alone." "This isn't the time to argue," Vaughn snapped, checking his revolver. "No, it isn't," Willow agreed, moving to his side. "Which is why you should know that I can shoot as well as most men and better than some. My father made sure of it." A flash of grudging admiration crossed Vaughn's face. "Can you handle a rifle, Winchester or Spencer?" "Winchester," he said, gesturing to the rack. Willow selected the weapon, checking it with practiced hands. "Loaded and ready, Mrs." Holloway watched the exchange with wide eyes. "Heaven help us," she muttered. "2 of you cut from the same cloth." "Mrs. Holloway, if you'd rather seek shelter, I understand," Vaughn said, his tone gentler. "But we could use another pair of eyes if you're willing." The older woman squared her shoulders. "My late husband was a Texas Ranger, Mr. Northcott. I've loaded my share of guns in my time." A crash from the front of the house ended their conversation. The sound of breaking glass was followed by the whoosh of flames, a torch thrown through a window. "They're trying to smoke us out," Vaughn said grimly, "just like before." Another crash came from the back of the house. The smell of smoke began to fill the air. "We can't stay here," Willow said, coughing as the acrid fumes reached them. Vaughn nodded, his mind working rapidly. "The stable. If we can reach the horses, we might outrun them." He turned to Mrs. Holloway. "There's a trapdoor in the pantry that leads to a root cellar. It has an exit that comes up behind the stable. Can you make it there?" The older woman nodded. "I'll go first, make sure it's clear." As Mrs. Holloway slipped away, Vaughn turned to Willow, his face grave in the thickening smoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is my fight, not yours. I never should have brought you into it." Willow's grip tightened on the rifle. "I chose this path, remember? Whatever comes, we face it together." Outside, the men were growing bolder, their shouts closer to the house. A bullet shattered another window, embedding itself in the far wall. "Stay low," Vaughn instructed as they moved toward the pantry. The smoke was growing thicker, flames visible now through the broken windows. They reached the pantry just as Mrs. Holloway was disappearing through the trapdoor. "It's clear so far," she called up to them. "Come quickly." Vaughn insisted Willow go next. The root cellar was cool and dark after the smoke-filled house, the earthy smell of stored vegetables a sharp contrast to the burning wood above. A narrow tunnel led away from the house, dug years ago by a previous owner concerned about Indian attacks. They emerged behind the stable, just as Vaughn had said they would. The night air was a relief after the suffocating smoke, but they had no time to savor it. The stable was still untouched by the fire, but the main house was fully ablaze now, flames shooting high into the night sky. "The horses will be panicked," Vaughn said as they crept toward the stable doors. "Mrs. Holloway, can you stay here and cover us? Shoot if anyone comes around the side of the building." The older woman took the rifle Willow offered her, settling into position behind a water trough. "Be quick," she urged. Inside the stable, the horses were indeed agitated, whinnying and stamping at the smell of smoke and the sounds of shouting outside. Vaughn moved swiftly to calm his gelding while Willow approached the mare she often rode when visiting the ranch. "Easy, Sadie," she murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "We're getting out of here." They worked rapidly to saddle the horses, ears straining for any sign that their attackers had discovered their escape route. Just as they were leading the animals toward the back exit, a shot rang out, followed by Mrs. Holloway's voice raised in warning. "They're coming around the side," she called. "Hurry!" Vaughn boosted Willow into the saddle, then swung up onto his own horse. "Mrs. Holloway, mount up!" He shouted, leading a third horse toward her position. The older woman fired once more before scrambling aboard, her movements surprisingly agile for her age. "Which way?" she panted as they gathered together. "The creek," Vaughn decided. "We can follow it to town, staying under cover as much as possible." They burst from the stable just as the first of their attackers rounded the corner of the burning building. Shots echoed behind them as they galloped toward the line of trees that marked the creek bed, bullets whizzing past their heads. Willow bent low over her horse's neck, urging the animal to greater speed. Beside her, Vaughn rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. Mrs. Holloway was a less accomplished rider but clung gamely to her mount, keeping pace with them. They reached the trees and plunged into the shallow water of the creek, the horses' hooves splashing loudly in the night. Behind them, their pursuers shouted in anger, the sounds of their horses growing fainter as the creek bent away from the ranch house. For nearly an hour they rode, following the winding path of the water, sometimes in the creek itself to mask their tracks, sometimes on the banks when the going was too treacherous. Finally, when no sounds of pursuit could be heard and the glow of the burning ranch house was no longer visible behind them, Vaughn called a halt. "We need to rest the horses," he said, dismounting, "and decide where to go from here." They tethered the animals and gathered in a small clearing, speaking in low voices despite the apparent absence of their attackers. "Who were those men?" Mrs. Holloway asked, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes alert. "Hired guns," Vaughn replied. "Working for a man I crossed paths with in Kansas, Samuel Blackwater." He glanced at Willow. "I told you about him." She nodded, remembering their conversation in the buggy. "The man whose brothers you killed during a bank robbery. He's been looking for me for 3 years," Vaughn continued. "I thought I'd covered my tracks well enough, but somehow he found me." His expression darkened. "And now he's burned me out again." "What will you do?" Mrs. Holloway asked. Vaughn was silent for a moment, his face grim in the moonlight filtering through the trees. "I can't keep running," he said finally, "and I can't let him destroy another home." He looked at Willow, his eyes filled with determination and something else of vulnerability she'd never seen before. I have too much to lose now." Willow moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "We'll face this together," she said firmly. "But we need help. We should continue to Bandera and speak with Sheriff Davis." Vaughn shook his head. "Blackwater's men won't hesitate to burn the whole town if that's what it takes to get to me. I won't put more innocent people in danger." "Then what's your plan?" Willow challenged. "To ride off alone and confront them. That's suicide, Vaughn." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it seemed to startle them both. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension of their situation heightening the emotions that had been building between them for weeks. Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat. "If I might suggest," she said, "my late husband had a hunting cabin about 10 miles south of here. It's well hidden and defensible. We could rest there, gather supplies, and send word to the sheriff without putting the town at risk." Vaughn considered the suggestion. "Do you think Blackwater's men know about it? It's not on any maps, and John never registered it with the land office," Mrs. Holloway said with a small smile. "He valued his privacy almost as much as you do, Mr. Northcott." "Then that's where we'll go," Vaughn decided. "Can you lead the way, Mrs. Holloway?" The older woman nodded, already moving toward her horse. "It'll take a few hours, but we should reach it before dawn." As Willow prepared to mount up again, Vaughn caught her arm, drawing her aside. "I need you to know," he said in a low voice, "that whatever happens, these past weeks have been more precious to me than I can say." Willow felt her heart constrict at the finality in his tone. "Don't talk as if you're saying goodbye," she said fiercely. "We're going to find a way through this." Vaughn's hand came up to touch the locket he had given her, resting against her collarbone. "I want to believe that," he said softly. "But if things go wrong, they won't," Willow interrupted, covering his hand with hers where it lay against her skin. "I've already lost one home to fire, Vaughn Northcott. I'm not losing another or the man who saved me from it." Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, fierce kiss that conveyed everything she wasn't ready to put into words. When she pulled back, Vaughn's eyes were wide with surprise, then darkened with an emotion that made her breath catch. "That," he said roughly, "is something worth fighting for, Mrs." Holloway's cabin proved to be exactly as she had described, a small, sturdy structure nestled in a wooded valley, with good sightlines in all directions, and a spring fed well nearby. They arrived just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the horses tired but still strong. "It's not much," Mrs. Holloway said as she unlocked the door, "but it's solid, and John kept it well stocked with provisions and ammunition." Inside, the cabin was simply furnished with a table, chairs, a small stove, and 2 narrow beds. A loft accessed by a ladder provided additional sleeping space. Dust covered everything, but otherwise the cabin was in good condition. "You and Miss Newcomb take the beds," Vaughn said to Mrs. Holloway. "I'll keep watch for now." Willow shook her head. "You need rest as much as we do. We'll take turns standing guard." After some argument, Vaughn agreed to a rotating watch schedule. Mrs. Holloway would rest first, then Willow, while Vaughn took the first watch. They unsaddled the horses and led them to a small corral behind the cabin, providing water and what feed they could find in the old stable. Inside, they made a cold meal from the supplies Mrs. Holloway had discovered in the cabin's larder: jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit. No one had much appetite, but they ate to keep up their strength, washing the food down with water from the well. As Mrs. Holloway settled onto one of the beds, Willow joined Vaughn by the window, where he had positioned himself with a clear view of the approach to the cabin. "What's your plan?" she asked quietly. Vaughn's gaze remained on the landscape outside, scanning for any sign of movement. When you and Mrs. Holloway have rested, I'll ride back toward Bandera, but not all the way to town. There's a way station about halfway where I can leave a message for Sheriff Davis. And then—" He finally looked at her, his expression resolute. "And then I end this, one way or another." Willow studied his face, reading the determination there, but also the weariness. "You're exhausted," she said gently. "You won't be any good to anyone if you collapse from fatigue." Vaughn rubbed a hand over his face. "I'll rest when I know you're both safe." "We're as safe as we can be for now," she insisted. "Let me take the first watch, please." After a moment's hesitation, Vaughn nodded, surrendering to the logic of her argument. "Wake me in 3 hours, or immediately if you see anything suspicious." He moved to the second bed, but didn't lie down. Instead, he sat on the edge, watching as Willow positioned herself by the window with the Winchester across her lap. "Willow," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. When she turned to look at him, he continued, "About what happened at the creek." "This isn't the time to discuss it," she said, her cheeks warming at the memory of their kiss. "It might be the only time we have," he countered. "I need you to know that I—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. Willow's heart pounded against her ribs. "Yes." Vaughn's eyes held hers, intense and sincere. "I've been falling in love with you since the night I rode through that fire to find you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, more powerful for its straightforwardness. Willow felt something unfurl within her chest, a warmth that pushed back against the fear and uncertainty of their situation. "I think," she said carefully, "that I've been falling in love with you for just as long." A smile transformed Vaughn's weary face, making him look younger, lighter. "Then we have one more reason to make sure we all get through this." He lay down then, still fully dressed except for his boots, his gun within easy reach. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, the lines of worry momentarily smoothed from his face. Willow returned her attention to the window, her senses alert for any sign of danger. But part of her mind remained with Vaughn's words, replaying them over and over. He loved her, and she had admitted finally that she loved him too. Whatever came next, that truth would sustain her. The hours of her watch passed uneventfully. When it was time to wake Vaughn, Willow found herself reluctant to disturb his much-needed rest. But they had agreed on 3 hours, and she knew he would be angry if she let him sleep longer. She touched his shoulder gently. "Vaughn, it's time." He came awake instantly, his hand moving to his gun before he registered who had woken him. "Anything?" he asked, sitting up. "All quiet," she assured him. "The horses are settled and there's been no sign of anyone approaching." Vaughn nodded, rising and stretching his tall frame. "Get some sleep now. I'll wake Mrs. Holloway for the third watch." But Willow hesitated, caught between exhaustion and a strange reluctance to let him out of her sight. "Vaughn, about what you said before." He moved closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her shoulders. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "And when this is over, I want to say it properly without fear hanging over us." Willow nodded, understanding. "Then I'll hold you to that promise." She slept deeply despite the circumstances, her body surrendering to exhaustion, when Mrs. Holloway woke her for her turn at watch again. The sun was already high in the sky. "Where's Vaughn?" she asked, immediately noticing his absence. Mrs. Holloway's expression was troubled. "He left about an hour ago, said he was going to the way station as planned." A spike of fear shot through Willow. "Alone? Why didn't you wake me?" "He was quite insistent that you needed your rest," the older woman said, "and he promised to be back before nightfall." Willow tried to calm the anxiety rising within her. Vaughn was skilled and careful. He would be alert for any sign of Blackwater's men. And the way station was only a few hours' ride. "Did he say anything else?" she asked, rising and straightening her rumpled dress as best she could. Mrs. Holloway's face softened. "Only that if he wasn't back by tomorrow morning, we should take the horses and make for Bandera by a roundabout route." She paused, then added, "And that he loves you very much, my dear." Tears pricked at Willow's eyes. "He told you that." "He didn't need to, Mrs. Holloway said with a small smile. "It's written all over his face whenever he looks at you. But yes, he did say it, and asked me to tell you if—" She didn't complete the sentence. Willow squared her shoulders, refusing to consider the possibility that Vaughn might not return. "Well, that won't be necessary because he will be back before nightfall, just as he promised." But nightfall came, and Vaughn did not return. As darkness descended on the small cabin, Willow's anxiety grew with each passing hour. She paced the limited confines of the room, alternating between the windows, peering out into the gathering gloom for any sign of a rider approaching. "He might have had to wait for the sheriff," Mrs. Holloway suggested, as she prepared a simple supper from their dwindling supplies. "Or perhaps he's being cautious, avoiding traveling after dark." Willow nodded, trying to take comfort in the logical explanations. But a sense of foreboding had settled over her, a certainty that something had gone wrong. "I'm going to look for him," she announced abruptly, moving toward the door. Mrs. Holloway stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "That would be foolish, and Mr. Northcott would be the first to tell you so. You can't go blundering about in the dark when there are armed men looking for him. I can't just sit here doing nothing." "You can and you will," the older woman said firmly. "At least until morning. If he hasn't returned by then, we'll follow his instructions and make for Bandera." Willow knew Mrs. Holloway was right, but the waiting was unbearable. She forced herself to eat some of the food the older woman had prepared, knowing she would need her strength, then resumed her position by the window, rifle at the ready. The night crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every rustle in the underbrush, every call of a night bird made Willow start, hoping it was Vaughn approaching. But each time, disappointment followed. Dawn found her still at her post, hollow-eyed from lack of sleep but determined. As the first light of day filtered through the trees, she made her decision. "I'm going to the way station," she told Mrs. Holloway. "You stay here in case Vaughn returns. If I'm not back by midday, follow his instructions and head for Bandera." Mrs. Holloway looked as if she wanted to argue but seemed to recognize the futility of it. "Be careful," she said instead. "John always said the most dangerous animal in these woods walks on two legs." Willow saddled Sadie, the mare she had ridden from the ranch, and loaded the Winchester into the saddle scabbard. She had changed into a pair of Mrs. Holloway's late husband's trousers, finding them more practical for riding than her torn and dirty dress. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she promised as she mounted up. "With Vaughn, if at all possible." The way station was a small, rough building serving as a stop for the stagecoach that ran weekly between Bandera and the surrounding settlements. It was maintained by an elderly man named Jenkins, who lived there alone with his dogs and served as a relay point for messages. As Willow approached the clearing where the station stood, she slowed Sadie to a walk, suddenly cautious. Something about the scene ahead didn't look right. The usual thin trail of smoke from Jenkins's chimney was absent, and there was an unnatural stillness about the place. She dismounted at the edge of the trees, tethering Sadie securely before continuing on foot, Winchester in hand. As she drew closer, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The station door hung open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. "Mr. Jenkins," she called softly, approaching with caution. "It's Willow Newcomb." No answer came from within. Taking a deep breath, Willow stepped over the threshold. The interior of the way station was in disarray, chairs overturned, papers scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room lay Jenkins, his vacant eyes staring at the ceiling, a dark stain spreading across his shirt from the bullet hole in his chest. Willow pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a cry of horror. The old man had been killed, and recently within the last day, judging by the condition of the body. Fighting down panic, she searched the room for any sign of Vaughn. There was no evidence he had been there, no message left with Jenkins, just destruction and death. She was about to leave when something caught her eye, a piece of paper partially hidden beneath Jenkins's outstretched hand. Steeling herself, Willow knelt and carefully extracted it. It was a telegram, crumpled and stained with blood, but still legible. Northcott, stop, return what you took or more will die, stop Blackwater. Willow stared at the paper in confusion. What had Vaughn taken? She knew the story of his confrontation with the Blackwater brothers, but he had never mentioned taking anything. A sound outside made her freeze, the unmistakable creak of a saddle as someone dismounted. Quickly, Willow folded the telegram and tucked it into her pocket, then moved to the side of the door, pressing herself against the wall, rifle ready. "Jenkins, you in there, old man?" A rough voice called. Willow held her breath as footsteps approached the open door. A man stepped into the way station, his back to her as he surveyed the scene before him. He wore a badge on his vest, one of Sheriff Davis's deputies, she realized with relief. "Deputy," she said, lowering her rifle. The man whirled, his hand dropping to his sidearm before he recognized her. "Miss Newcomb, what in tarnation are you doing here?" "Looking for Vaughn Northcott," she said, stepping forward. "He was supposed to come here yesterday to leave a message for Sheriff Davis." The deputy, Wilson, she remembered his name, shook his head. "Haven't seen Northcott in days. The sheriff sent me out here because Jenkins missed the regular mail pickup." Willow explained quickly about the fire at the ranch, the men who had attacked them, and Vaughn's plan to seek help from the sheriff. "Sounds like Blackwater finally caught up to him," Wilson said grimly. "The sheriff's been on the lookout for those men ever since Northcott warned him they might show up someday." "You know what this means?" Willow asked, showing him the telegram. "What did Vaughn take that this man wants returned?" Wilson studied the paper, his brow furrowed. "Can't say for sure. But there were rumors, after that bank robbery in Kansas, that some important documents went missing along with the cash. Papers that could incriminate Blackwater in some mighty unsavory business dealings." It made sense, Willow realized. Vaughn had been a lawman after all. He would have seized evidence along with recovering the stolen money. "We need to find him," she said urgently. "Blackwater's men must have intercepted him on his way here." Wilson nodded. "I'll ride back to town and gather a posse. You should come with me, Miss Newcomb." "It's not safe for you out here." But Willow shook her head. "Mrs. Holloway is waiting for me at her cabin. I need to let her know what's happened." After giving Wilson directions to the cabin, Willow mounted Sadie once more and set off, her mind racing. If Blackwater's men had Vaughn, where would they take him? Back to the burned-out ranch? To Bandera? Or somewhere else entirely? She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sign, a piece of cloth caught on a branch beside the trail. Reining in, she dismounted to investigate. It was a scrap of blue fabric, the same color as the shirt Vaughn had been wearing when he left the cabin. Heart pounding, Willow examined the ground around the spot. The earth was hard and dry, not conducive to leaving tracks, but she could make out what looked like several horses having passed this way, heading not toward Bandera but east, away from town. Making a swift decision, she remounted and turned Sadie in the direction the horses had gone. She would follow the trail as far as she could, then circle back to Mrs. Holloway's cabin before midday as promised. The trail, such as it was, led her through increasingly rough country, away from the established paths and into a region of rocky outcroppings and scraggly trees. Twice more she found small signs of passage, a freshly broken branch, a cigarette but not yet dissolved by the morning dew. The sun was climbing higher in the sky when Willow spotted smoke rising above the trees ahead. Cautiously, she dismounted and tethered Sadie, proceeding on foot with the Winchester cradled in her arms. The smoke came from a small campfire in a clearing surrounded by rocks. 3 men sat around it, passing a bottle between them, and tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing was Vaughn. Willow's heart leaped at the sight of him, alive but clearly battered. His face was bruised, blood staining the front of his shirt, his hands bound behind him around the trunk of the tree. She counted quickly 3 men that she could see, all armed with revolvers and rifles. Too many for her to take on directly. She needed a plan. Retreating to where she'd left Sadie, Willow considered her options. She could ride back to the cabin, wait for Wilson and the posse. But that would take hours, and there was no telling what these men might do to Vaughn in the meantime. No, she had to act now, but smartly. She remembered her father's words from long ago. Sometimes, Willow girl, the best approach is to make your enemy think you're something you're not. A plan began to form in her mind. It was dangerous, possibly foolhardy, but it might just work if she could convince these men. She was more of a threat than a lone woman with a rifle. Returning to Sadie, she mounted up and circled wide around the camp, positioning herself on higher ground to the east of the clearing. Then, taking a deep breath, she fired the Winchester into the air 3 times in rapid succession, the shots echoing off the rocks. "That's far enough, gentlemen," she called out in her most authoritative voice. "This is Deputy Wilson of the Bandera Sheriff's Office. You're surrounded by a posse of armed men." The effect on the camp was immediate. The 3 men leaped to their feet, reaching for their weapons, looking around wildly for the source of the voice. "Throw down your guns and put your hands in the air." Willow continued, shifting position slightly between each command to create the illusion of multiple speakers. "This is your only warning." She fired again, deliberately splintering a branch near one of the men, who jumped back with a curse. "You're bluffing, lawman," one of them shouted back. "I don't see no posse." "That's because we're good at our jobs," Willow replied, moving yet again. "But if you'd prefer a demonstration." She fired 3 more shots in quick succession, aiming carefully to kick up dirt near the men's feet without actually hitting them. The ruse was having an effect. The men were nervous, exchanging uncertain glances. But they weren't surrendering yet. Time to raise the stakes. "We know who you are," Willow called out. "Men working for Samuel Blackwater. The same Blackwater who's wanted in 3 states for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. You think he's going to help you when you're facing a hangman's noose? Think again, boys." She could see the men conferring now, their confidence clearly shaken. But they still hadn't dropped their weapons. At the tree, Vaughn had raised his head, alert to what was happening. Even from a distance, Willow could see recognition dawn in his eyes as he realized who was behind the deception. "Last chance," she shouted. "Surrender now, or we start shooting to kill." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the men placed his gun on the ground and raised his hands. "Don't be a fool, Parker," another hissed. "I ain't dying for Blackwater's grudge," the man named Parker replied. "I signed on to scare a man, not face a firing squad." Seeing his companions surrender, a second man reluctantly followed suit, placing his weapon down and stepping back with his hands raised. Only the third man remained defiant, his gun still clutched in his hand. He backed toward Vaughn, using him as a shield. "I ain't going to prison," he growled. "You want Northcott alive, you let me ride out of here." Willow's heart pounded as she considered her next move. Her bluff had worked on 2 of the men, but this third one was either braver or more desperate than his companions. "That's not going to happen," she called back, still disguising her voice. "Let him go and drop your weapon." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for Vaughn himself. As the man backed closer to him, Vaughn suddenly twisted, despite his bound hands, and slammed his head backward into his captor's face. The unexpected blow caught the man off guard. He stumbled, his grip on his weapon loosening just enough for Willow to take her shot. She fired, the bullet striking his arm. With a howl of pain, he dropped the gun, clutching at his bleeding limb. "Now!" Willow shouted, breaking from cover and racing toward the clearing, rifle aimed at the 3 men. They stared in shock as she approached, not a posse of lawmen, but a lone woman with fire in her eyes and unwavering aim. "On your knees, hands behind your heads," she ordered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Do it now." Stunned by this unexpected turn of events, the men complied. Keeping the rifle trained on them, Willow moved to Vaughn's side, using her free hand to work at the ropes binding him. "Are you hurt badly?" she asked, her voice low with concern. "I've been better," he admitted, grimacing as the ropes fell away and blood rushed back into his cramped arms. "But I'll live, thanks to you. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen." "I'll let you decide which after we get out of this," she replied, helping him to his feet. Vaughn retrieved the fallen man's gun, his movements stiff with pain but his eyes alert. "We need to secure them until the real law arrives." Using the ropes that had bound Vaughn, they tied the 3 men to trees, making sure they were tight enough to hold but not cruelly so. The one Willow had shot was sullen but cooperative after Vaughn roughly bandaged his wound. "Wilson should be on his way with a posse," Willow explained as they worked. "He was heading to Mrs. Holloway's cabin when I left." "And how exactly did you find me?" Vaughn asked, wincing as he straightened. Willow told him about the way station, Jenkins's body, and the telegram she had found. "What did you take from Blackwater that he wants returned?" she asked. Vaughn's expression darkened. "Evidence. Account books that prove he's been laundering money through banks across 3 states, using the robberies his brothers committed to cover his tracks." He sighed, rubbing his chafed wrists. "I should have turned them over to the federal marshal's office years ago, but I was afraid it would lead Blackwater straight to me, so I hid them instead." "Where?" "In a safe place," he said with a faint smile. "And now it's time they were used for what I intended all along, putting Blackwater behind bars where he belongs." They didn't have to wait long for Wilson and the posse to arrive. The deputy had gathered 8 men from Bandera, all well armed and determined to bring Blackwater's hired guns to justice. Mrs. Holloway rode with them, refusing to be left behind when she heard what had happened. "Northcott, you look like you've been dragged behind a horse," Wilson observed as he surveyed the scene. "And Miss Newcomb? Well, the sheriff's going to have a hard time believing this story." "Believe it," Vaughn said firmly. "If not for her quick thinking, I'd likely be dead by now." The journey back to Bandera was slow, with the prisoners on horseback under heavy guard and Vaughn still weak from his ordeal. But by nightfall, they reached the town, where Sheriff Davis was waiting at his office. The sheriff was a grizzled veteran of the Texas Rangers, not easily impressed. But as he listened to Wilson's account, supplemented by Vaughn and Willow's testimony, his bushy eyebrows rose higher and higher. "Miss Newcomb," he said when they had finished, "I've known your family since before you were born, and I never would have taken you for such a resourceful woman." Willow lifted her chin. "My father raised me to handle whatever life throws my way, Sheriff." "So he did," Davis agreed with a nod of approval. "And what about these documents Blackwater's so keen to recover?" Vaughn exchanged a glance with Willow before answering. They're hidden at my ranch, or what's left of it, in a strong box beneath the hearthstones. We'll retrieve them tomorrow, the sheriff decided. Tonight, you both need rest and medical attention. He turned to Deputy Wilson. Wire the federal marshal in Austin. Tell him we've got evidence against Samuel Blackwater and 3 of his men in custody. As they left the sheriff's office, Vaughn took Willow's arm, steadying himself as much as supporting her. The boarding house, he suggested. She nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was now that the danger had passed. Martha Lawson welcomed them with exclamations of dismay at their appearance and immediately set about preparing rooms and hot baths. "You'll stay in my best rooms tonight," she insisted. "No arguments, and Dr. Pearson will be here shortly to look at those injuries, Mr. Northcott." When they had bathed and changed into clean clothes provided by Martha, another nightgown from her niece's collection for Willow, and some of her late husband's things for Vaughn, they met in the boarding house's small parlor. Dr. Pearson had come and gone, leaving Vaughn with bandaged ribs and strict instructions to rest. They sat in silence for a moment, the events of the past days settling around them like dust after a storm. Outside, the sounds of Bandera at night drifted in through the open-window piano music from the saloon down the street, the occasional burst of laughter, horses' hooves on the packed earth of the main street. "So," Willow said at last, "what happens now?" Vaughn's eyes met hers, warm and steady in the lamplight. "Now I keep the promise I made at the cabin." "Which promise was that?" she asked, though she knew. He smiled, reaching across to take her hand. "The one where I told you that when this was over, I would say properly what I only managed to blurt out in exhaustion and fear." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm. "I love you, Willow Newcomb. I have since the moment you stood in that burning cabin and looked at me with those determined eyes of yours, refusing to give up even when all seemed lost." Willow felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "And I love you, Vaughn Northcott. Not just for saving me from the fire, but for everything that came after, for treating me as an equal, for valuing my opinions, for showing me that there could be a future beyond what I had lost." Vaughn's other hand came up to touch the locket he had given her, still hanging around her neck despite all they had been through. "I want to build that future with you," he said softly, "if you'll have me." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Willow's heart seemed to skip a beat. "I am." Vaughn's smile deepened, creasing the corners of his eyes. "Though I had planned a more romantic proposal before Blackwater's men interrupted our dinner." Willow laughed, the sound bright in the quiet room. "I think we've had enough drama for a while. A simple question will do nicely." Vaughn stood, wincing slightly at the movement, and knelt before her chair despite his injured ribs. "Willow Newcomb, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her hands framing his face. "Yes, I will." As his lips met hers in a tender kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows, Willow knew that the fire that had destroyed her home had not taken everything from her after all. Instead, it had led her to something far more precious, a love born in the flames, tempered by danger, and stronger for all they had overcome together. The wedding of Vaughn Northcott and Willow Newcomb took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Bandera. The town had turned out in force for the occasion, curious to witness the union of the mysterious rancher and the woman who had helped bring down Samuel Blackwater's hired guns. For Blackwater himself had finally been arrested, following the evidence provided by Vaughn's hidden documents. The federal marshal had personally come to Bandera to collect the account books and take statements from Vaughn and the 3 captured men, who had proven eager to testify against their employer in exchange for leniency. "You'll need to appear at the trial in Austin," the marshal had told Vaughn. "But given the evidence and testimony we have, I don't foresee any difficulties in securing a conviction. Blackwater will spend the rest of his days behind bars." With that threat removed, Vaughn and Willow had turned their attention to rebuilding. The ranch house had been a total loss, but the foundations remained sound, and with the help of neighbors and hired hands, a new structure began to rise from the ashes of the old. They had decided to rebuild on Vaughn's land rather than on Willow's former property. The memories of the Prairie fire were still too raw, and the practical considerations favored Vaughn's established ranch with its existing outbuildings and water sources. But they incorporated timber and stone from Willow's land into the new house, a tangible reminder of where they had come from. On their wedding day, Willow wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha Lawson had helped her select during a special trip to San Antonio. Her hair was adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning from the prairie, which had begun to recover from the fire with the fall rains, tender green shoots emerging from the blackened earth. Vaughn waited for her at the altar, tall and handsome in a new suit, his gray-blue eyes lighting up as she walked down the aisle on Sheriff Davis's arm. The gruff lawman had offered to give her away in her father's absence, an honor that had brought tears to Willow's eyes when he suggested it. "You'd have made him proud, girl," Davis had told her, "standing up to those outlaws the way you did. Your father always said you had more grit than most men he knew." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Willow thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a desperate rescue in a prairie fire to a love that had withstood danger and uncertainty. "With this ring, I thee wed," Vaughn said, sliding a gold band onto her finger. It had been his mother's, he told her, preserved through years of wandering as a reminder of the home he had once known and hoped to find again. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Willow felt a sense of completion, of rightness that she had never expected to find after losing her father and her home. Here, with Vaughn's hands warm around hers and his love shining in his eyes, she had found not just a new beginning but a homecoming. The celebration afterward was joyous, spilling from the church to the town square, where tables had been set up laden with food contributed by what seemed like every household in Bandera. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, as the community celebrated not just a wedding but a triumph of courage and perseverance. Mrs. Holloway, who had become a dear friend to both Vaughn and Willow during their ordeal, presented them with a quilt she had made from scraps of fabric salvaged from both their homes. "To remind you," she said, her eyes twinkling, "that something beautiful can always be created from what appears to be ruined." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Vaughn took Willow's hand and led her away from the festivities toward where their horses waited, saddled and ready. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Northcott?" he asked, the new name rolling off his tongue with evident pleasure. "More than ready, Mr. Northcott," she replied, smiling up at him. They rode side by side through the gathering dusk, the road to the ranch familiar now to them both. The new house was not yet complete, but enough had been finished to make it habitable: a bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting room with a wide stone hearth built from rocks gathered from both their lands. As they approached, Willow could see a light burning in the window, a beacon welcoming them home. Vaughn had arranged for Mrs. Holloway's nephew to light the lamps before leaving, ensuring they would return to warmth and light rather than darkness. Vaughn helped her dismount, then swept her into his arms before she could protest. "It's tradition," he said with a grin, carrying her toward the door. "Your ribs," Willow reminded him, though she made no move to free herself from his embrace. "Healed enough for this," he assured her, stepping carefully over the threshold into their new home. He set her down in the center of the sitting room, but kept his arms around her waist, holding her close. "Welcome home, Willow." She looked around at the simple furnishings, the walls that still smelled of fresh cut pine, the hearth where a fire had been laid ready for lighting. It was nothing like the home she had grown up in, nothing like the well-established ranch house Vaughn had lost. But it was theirs, built with their own hands and the help of those who cared for them. "It's perfect," she said, turning back to him. "Everything I could have wished for." Vaughn's hand came up to touch the locket he had given her, which she still wore every day. "Sometimes," he said softly, "what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of something better than we could have imagined." As his lips found hers in the warm light of their first evening as husband and wife, Willow knew the truth of his words. The prairie fire that had surrounded her cabin, the cowboy who had ridden through flames to carry her to safety, these were not just moments of crisis and rescue, but the first threads in the tapestry of their life together, a life that stretched before them now, full of promise and possibility. 5 years later, Willow stood on the porch of the Northcott ranch house, watching as Vaughn taught their 4-year-old son, James, to sit astride his first pony. The little boy's face was alight with excitement, his dark hair so like his father's ruffled by the gentle spring breeze. "Not too fast now," she called, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. "Remember what happened last time?" Vaughn grinned up at her, his face more weathered now but his eyes still holding that same warmth that had captured her heart years ago. "That was my fault, not the boy's. I won't let him fall this time." James bounced impatiently in the small saddle. "I want to go fast like Papa, all in good time, son," Vaughn assured him, keeping a firm hand on the pony's bridle. "First, you learn how to sit properly and give commands. Then you can think about going fast." Willow smiled, watching the scene with a full heart. Their ranch had prospered beyond their early expectations, growing to include not just cattle but horses as well, with Vaughn developing a reputation for breeding and training some of the finest cow ponies in the region. Her own land had recovered from the fire, the prairie grass growing back thicker than before, nourished by the ash of what had burned. They had built a small cabin there, using it occasionally when working that part of their expanded range, but mostly as a retreat when they wanted time away from the responsibilities of the main ranch. The past 5 years had not been without challenges. There had been drought and disease among the cattle, economic downturns that affected the price of beef, and the everyday struggles of building a life together. But through it all, their love had only deepened, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. As promised, Samuel Blackwater had been convicted and imprisoned, his criminal empire dismantled by federal authorities using the evidence Vaughn had preserved. The threat he had represented was gone, allowing Vaughn to finally put that chapter of his life behind him. They had made a home and a family, created something lasting from the ashes of what they had lost. And as Willow watched her husband and son laughing together in the spring sunshine, she felt a profound gratitude for the fire that had changed the course of her life. That night, after James had been tucked into bed with stories of brave cowboys and wild mustangs, Willow and Vaughn sat together on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I had a letter from Mrs. Holloway today," Willow said, her head resting against Vaughn's shoulder. "She's coming for a visit next month. Says she's eager to see how James has grown and to be here when the baby arrives." Vaughn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "She's practically family at this point. James will be over the moon to see his grandma Holloway again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the creaking of the swing and the chorus of night insects the only sounds. Then Vaughn spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You ever think about it?" "That night when the fire surrounded your cabin," Willow nodded. "Sometimes, especially when there's a fire on the prairie, even a controlled one for clearing brush." She placed her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. "But mostly I think about what came after. How something that seemed like the end of everything turned out to be just the beginning." Vaughn turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the window behind them. "I thank God every day that I decided to check that cabin instead of riding past. And I thank God you're the kind of man who would ride through fire for a stranger," Willow replied, lifting her face for his kiss. Later, as they lay together in the bedroom of the house they had built from the ruins of their separate lives, Vaughn's hand resting protectively over the swell of their unborn child, Willow reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The prairie fire had taken everything she thought she had valued: her home, her father's legacy, the life she had known. But from those flames had emerged a love stronger and truer than anything she could have imagined, a partnership based on mutual courage and respect, and a family that filled her heart to overflowing. Sometimes, she thought as sleep began to claim her, the most beautiful things do indeed rise from the ashes of what has been lost. And sometimes, it takes a cowboy brave enough to ride through flames to show you the way to a future you never dared to dream might be yours.